Just a quick introduction. Campus Oxfordshire ran a tactical voting campaign in 23 and 24 to drain the blue from Oxfordshire. And the blue was indeed magnificently drained, and we hope our campaigns had a role in producing that outcome. At the time, tackling the Tories felt like wrestling a hydra to the ground. But just like those films where the fiend turns out to be rather tiny in comparison with a similar but vastly bigger beast looming right behind the conquering heroes, so our fight to depose the Tories now feels dwarfed by the magnitude of Trumpism and its global effects. The wrong response to this threat is to despair and plunge one's head into the sand for solace and distraction. Why? Firstly, because it's precisely how they want you to respond. Your shutting down does their work for them of switching the light off for democracy. Secondly, because the UK still has a centre-left progressive majority. It's fragile but tangible, concrete evidence that we still have efficacy in demanding change. Thirdly, because if ever there was a time to fight for our democracy, now surely is it. You're here because I guess you recognise this. There are many aspects to a healthy democracy that we all want to fight for, from environmental climate action to PR, fair taxation, better social care. But we'll continue to struggle with all these endeavours unless we get to grips with the far-right disinformation ecosystem growing in our midst, via our social media, our mainstream press, and by grassroots organisations. Successful progressive policymaking on climate action, fair taxation, voting reform, and so on must be anchored by veracity, must be based on adherence to standards of truth and accountability. Progressive politics will be constantly undermined in a society that's flooded by disinformation. US big tech now dominates the global media space, using algorithms to amplify extreme ideologies. Here I'd like to quote from the historian Farah Dabhoiwala. He says, "Press and speech freedom should encompass the rights of the public to receive truthful information, not just the unfettered liberty of individuals and corporations to act as they please. We must oppose greedy profiteering from lies by giant corporations, election interference and by foreign billionaires, and the spread of dangerous untruths. Instead of absolute liberty of expression, real truth-seeking depends on regulation." The end of quote. The far-right speech mantra is utter hypocrisy. They continually exercise their power to shut down any content they dislike, but they use this First Amendment to keep the world's online arteries mechanically prized open so they can continue pouring in their post-truth poison. Big tech has to be made responsible for violating the truth and for the democratic and human rights abuses that ensue. Like elsewhere, UK democracy is being undermined by big tech disinformation and lack of accountability. Labour has to grasp that its own survival depends on reforming the UK's conduits of information. It must also recognise the full extent and urgency of the reforms needed, find the courage to make them, and articulate a progressive vision to underpin them. We're here today to discuss these issues and the levers of change that, as ordinary citizens, we have. Thank you. So before we go on to hearing our speakers, I'd just like to tell you briefly about the Q&A cards and how they work. You should all have a card, and I hope you've all got a pen. You've got plenty of pens if you haven't. Please could you write your questions to the speakers on the card, and please also write your name on the card and indicate if your question is for a particular speaker. Please keep your questions short. At the start of the break, could you leave your cards with Matt, Jonathan and Mark over there? Yes, over there. And they'll select some questions and invite you to ask yours if you'd like to. Okay, hi. So onwards. The first speaker I would like to introduce is Neal Lawson. Neal is Executive Director of Compass, and he serves on the advisory board of the social democracy journal Renewal. He's an advisor to public ownership campaigners, We Own It, and other things, yeah. He writes about politics, democracy, societal transformation in The Guardian, New Statesman, Prospect magazine as well. And he's been a trade union researcher and advisor to Gordon Brown. So can we give a round of applause for...
I did advise Gordon Brown, but he never took my advice. The first thing I want to do is congratulate Claire and all the progressives in Oxford for what they've done to change the colour of this county. I know you like your blues in Oxford, but it's great to see the city and the county turn from blue to red to green to yellow, and to win, really important victories in places like Banbury, Henley and Tame, Didcot and Wantage and Witney and more. But I think the point is that winning office is never enough. You have to win power. And you have to do it as we live in these really turbulent, chaotic times. The madness of Trump, the horror of war, the uncertainty about our economy, climate chaos. Now, if only there was a kind of really simple device that could help us navigate these difficult times and get us to a good society, something that consistently pointed in the right direction and told us where to go. Now, I'm here to talk briefly about two recent Compass publications. Oh, there's an idea about something that could point us in the right direction and help us navigate these really turbulent, difficult times, a Compass. So two Compass publications, After the Riots and Thin Ice. I don't know if we've got any copies of any of this stuff around, but if not, you can download it from the website. Let's start with After the Riots, which was published after, you can guess what events, which seemed like an awful long time ago now, doesn't it? It was last summer, the end of last summer when these things happened. And I wrote an analysis of what I thought was going on. And when I wrote it, I was really nervous, really, because it's very easy to have an analysis that says that this is all about bad people on the right, with their fake news, with their spreading of hatred, their organising, etc. And all of that is true. But it's much harder to look at yourselves and look at your own politics and look at what's happened over the last 20, 30, 40 years that has got us to this point. Because as I said in the piece, there's one very simple truth, that happy people in happy places don't riot and they're not racist. And if the progressive gamble is that given enough support, love and care, then most people will do the right things, which I think is what the belief of everyone in this room today, then surely that the opposite is the case. So riots are something that happens after decades of deindustrialization, when the kind of dignity and pride of work and places are replaced by, humiliating bullshit jobs or incapacity benefit. Riots are what happens when once proud and vibrant high streets are simply shut down and boarded up. They're what happens when there are kind of wave after wave of hostile change, austerity, then Brexit, then COVID, and now at very least austerity light, when people are already struggling. Riots are what happens when unelected and unaccountable Bank of England or the Office of Budget Responsibility decide how much money disabled people are going to get. Politics done to us by technocrats, not decided by us, by our politicians who are accountable to us. Riots are what happens when democracy doesn't work, when your vote is taken for granted and it's presumed that you have nowhere else to go and no one's going to listen to you, and your vote never counts anyway. Riots are what happens when the state is remote and cold and everything works for the rich and the already powerful and not for you. And this is the difficult bit, I think. Riots happen not just when people are economically left behind, but when emotionally and culturally they are othered. When we look down on them and sneer at them and think that their decisions over issues like Brexit are just plain stupid. But when people are given an emergency button to hit for the first time in their life, and the first time in their life, their vote really counts, and it's really important, and it's going to change stuff, however mad you think that is, then we have to really listen to those people and understand what's happened to their lives, and why do they feel so alienated, and why do they want to do that kind of act? Because they are desperate, because they are scared, because we haven't looked after them to the extent that we should, because we don't understand their lives. We didn't even know that that was going to happen. We didn't feel it was possible. We weren't in touch with our country and our people. So I think all of that stuff makes us think, and we should empathise more and condemn less. Yes, of course, in the over those summer weekends when there were the riots, of course there are people that are racist, and of course there are people who are thugs, and of course we have to deal with them. But the majority of people who are now voting for reform, a quarter of our fellow country people, most of those people aren't racist, they're not thugs, they're people who are lost, frustrated and resentful. And I think they have a right to be, and we should be thinking about why they're like that. So as the days warm up, as it is today, and the days get longer, I think there will be more riots. I predict a riot, because those people are still let down, still frustrated, still resentful. And they're particularly resentful because they were promised change last July and they haven't had it. So there's going to be more of this stuff. And all of this begs really difficult questions for us as progressives about nation and patriotism, about immigration and the pace of cultural change, about how we both face the future, but also we recognise the past, how we both modernise and conserve our country. What do we think about notions of class? How do we find the resources to invest in jobs and communities, public services and places that enrich our social soil and not just degrade it? How do we understand the causes of extremism without condoning it? How do we regulate social media? All this and more we have to work our way through. And that demands a politics that is both tolerant and curious, and people who are willing to say, I don't know, I'm not sure. People who want to negotiate a better future and not just impose it. Welcome to the world of Claire and Compass and the kind of politics that we try and promote, where we can be those kind of people and have those kind of conversations. So turning quickly to the other publication, Thin Ice, which was the work we did to analyse what happened last July, when Labour, of course, won really big, but the victory was wide and incredibly shallow. To our frustration in Compass, the election was all about kicking out the Tories, and we understand why that was. But we kept asking the questions, well, what then? What then? Right? And people didn't want to listen, and they didn't want to talk about that. It was just get the Tories out. But there was always going to be a kickback to that. There are no shortcuts in politics. You have to dig really deep, intellectually, culturally and organisationally, if you want to change the world. And we didn't see that stuff going on within Labour. And now we are where we are. From back to the election, we know the figures. Labour won 64% of the seats with only 34% of the vote. That isn't democracy, that's a farce. And in 131 seats, Labour's margin of victory was less than 5,000. A 6% swing across the board would see Labour lose its majority at the next election. Reform came second in 98 seats, most of those Labour. The Greens came second in 39 seats, again, most of those Labour. Turnout was below 60%. The scale of tactical voting was unprecedented, with 4 in 10 Labour voters expressing weak or tactical support for the party. In almost 100 seats, the vote of the winning candidate was less than 35%. Again, that is not democracy, that is a farce. It used to be 10 seats of that number. Our democracy is not fit for purpose anymore. And get this, in 202 seats, what we in Compass call regressive tragedies, seats where the combined Tory and Reform vote was bigger than the winning progressive candidate. So all that Nigel Farage and whoever's going to be the next leader of the leader at the next election for the Conservative Party, all they have to do is exactly the same deal that Keir Starmer and Ed Davey did at the last election. Stand a paper-thin candidate, don't put any resources, don't put any time, and 202 seats could go to the right, just like that. So easy to do, they could sweep the board. And now Labour, with no plan and no vision, has quickly stumbled into what we'd say is survive the day mode. Their poll ratings have fallen by around 10%, while Reform have gained more than 10%. And look at the polling situation now. On many opinion polls, there are 5 parties polling in double digits. And this is a system that is explicitly designed for 2 parties. You end up in absolute and complete electoral chaos in those positions, where very, very tiny movements of votes, from one party to another, lead to huge changes and swings in seats. It's completely unpredictable. Now, we don't know what's around the corner, and we can't, all the events and who's going to go up and who's going to go down. But that multi-party politics, I think, is here to stay, and our electoral system is not fit for purpose. So in all of that, where is the hope? Where does the hope lie? It lies in 2 places. Something that Compass calls the progressive majority, which Claire referred to, and what we call a kind of growing systems consciousness in civil society. In every election since 1979, bar 2015, there's been a progressive voting majority in this country that far outstrips the Tory vote. Just think, in 1979, Thatcherism would never have happened if progressives had worked together, and what a different kind of world we could be in now. There's a table that compares how left-wing electorates are across the board internationally. And the UK scores almost 60% in terms of support for left-leaning parties. We're more progressive than Canada, Iceland, France, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Australia. This is a progressive country with progressive people. But this progressive majority is not given voice by our electoral system. Not just because it divides progressives and sets us against each other, but because to win, every time Labour thinks it has to kind of pander to the people who control the agenda in a first-past-the-post system, the people who donate to political parties, the big media moguls, and a few swing voters in a few swing seats. So Labour to win and not agitate and not get those people opposed to them, their promise is always, we won't change anything very much. And then you get over the line, and then you're in a kind of doom loop spiral. I'm being interrupted by a bell, but quite right. I'm going to finish very quickly, so don't worry, I'll be easily within my time. So we're in that doom loop now, and we feel it with a government that didn't build up a vision, didn't have an organisation, hasn't got the culture, hasn't got the alliance. And we're feeling the pressures of that now. So to finish, there is another way. In the face of Farage and fascism, there has to be. It's to unite the progressive voices in this country, to work together and not against each other. It is to say that on key issues like proportional representation, taxes on wealth, and the regulation of the media and social media, that we agree on the fundamentals that will change our democracy and could change our economy, and we will work together and vote together to make change happen. The real power of Reform and Nigel Farage and people like them is that they tell people what they already know, that our economy and our democratic system is broken, that society is in decline. Theirs is an elite revolt from above. Ours is a popular revolt from below, a popular front that gives voice to the progressive majority of this country, and so gives voices to those in civil society and communities who know the system is broken, and the policies that they want in terms of environment, equality, civil liberties, and you name it, cannot be squeezed through a system that is so orthodox, centralising and controlling. This is the progressive majority to be mobilised inside and outside of Parliament. And you don't mobilise that progressive majority by pandering to reform, by trumpeting how pleased you are to have deported people, to keep on going about deregulation or to cut in the way benefits and services in the way they are. That isn't the way to do it. This is a reference for older people in the room. Why do you kind of buy Freddie and the Dreamers when you can have the Beatles? You can't win by trying to out-reform reform. You have to present an alternative to them. So Prime Minister Farage has stopped being a nightmare and now looks instead like a possibility. Doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome is always a side of madness that will simply deliver high office to the lowest people. We're not mad, but we are determined. Determined to present a vision of a better society, determined to deliver policies that will underpin it and alliances that will make it happen. We're Compass, and we know that the test of a true radical is to make hope possible, not despair convincing. I think our time is now. So let's get on and build the work of people here in Oxford and across the country to make our dream of a good society a living reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neal. That was very pertinent and fascinating. I'd just like to introduce our next speaker, Callum. Callum is Liberal Democrat MP for Bicester and Woodstock. From 2012, he helped establish the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. He co-directed the school's international programs for public leaders and led research projects on national education systems such as RISE and government performance such as INSICE. Callum was previously a senior UK civil servant, latterly leading the offices of the Deputy Prime Minister and Cabinet Secretary. Anyway, I'd just like to welcome Callum.
Thank you so much, Claire, and it's a real pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I want to begin by just saying a big thank you to the many Compass friends in the audience. As Neal referred to, last year's election was a triumph for progressivism in Oxfordshire, and I'm truly grateful to the many from other parties who lent their support to Liberal Democrats in my constituency of Bicester and Woodstock and helped me get over the line. So many thanks to you. I've been asked this afternoon to say a few words about the challenge of disinformation in our political system and the impacts that it has. It's a vast topic, and especially in the company of some of the other speakers, I do not lay claim to be an expert in it. So what I intend to do is to lay out two aspects of it that I have some knowledge and experience of, and then finish by posing some questions about how we address this pernicious challenge. Because disinformation is something that poisons our politics and infects society. Let's be clear, it's a deliberate strategy to erode trust and to cause breakdown in our democratic institutions. It's accompanied by narratives attacking the so-called elites, denigrating scientific method, contesting the legitimacy of courts and investigative journalism. This is designed to make people susceptible to false information. And it distorts the concept of free speech. Free speech goes from being, I'm entitled to express my views, to no one is entitled to challenge the selective basis of my views. So it undermines the whole idea that we should have rational contestation of ideas. So responding to this assault is really hard because it's a deliberate and concerted strategy. And it's clear that in this country, as in others, our democratic governments and democratic institutions are struggling with the challenge. However, we cannot leave it to the online companies who profit so significantly from the emotive impact of disinformation as other content to self-regulate. So what I'd like to do is discuss two areas of this. The first, foreign influence, and the second, the impact of online harassment towards candidates in political elections as dimensions of this challenge. There's many more we could have chosen, but I thought I would just focus on these two. And I speak about foreign influence partly in my role as the foreign affairs spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats, in which capacity I speak regularly in the Commons and with other politicians about the impact of hostile states towards our democracy. Back in 2020, the then Conservative government and the Intelligence and Security Committee commissioned the Russia report, which was an attempt to look at the impact of Russia on our democratic processes. As many of you will know, disappointingly, large portions of that report were redacted, so we couldn't see all of the information that the committee gathered. But what it was clear about was that there had been clear attempts at foreign influence in our democratic processes, both the Indy referendum in Scotland in 2014 and the Brexit referendum. And the report said, and I quote, "The UK is clearly a target for Russia's disinformation campaigns and political interference operations," end of quote. So this then leads to some concerns about who holds responsibility for challenging this. One of the aspects of that report was to look at the responsibility that the intelligence agencies feel they have. Now, all of us who know the history of democracies and the history in which democracies slide into autocracies worry when agencies of that type, who it is hard to scrutinise, take on a role explicitly in democracy. And what's really clear from the report is that the agencies are themselves struggling with that. It's pretty evident that they are self-limiting in their willingness to get involved in protecting democracy when it comes to the interference of foreign states. And yet who's left? If the agencies who have the capacity to monitor and track some of these things are not stepping into that space, it's left to agencies like the Department for Culture, Media and Sport or the Electoral Commission to do so. Now, there are very good people working in both of those institutions, but they are stretched, and they would not themselves claim to have the capacity to be tackling and monitoring the kinds of effective, targeted and subterfuge in operations that the likes of Russia and others are undertaking. In 2023, the Conservative government put through the National Security Act, and they created a new offence of foreign interference. That was passed in July 2023. It was only on the 1st of April this year, so nearly 2 years later, that the now Labour government said that it was going to implement the Foreign Interference Registration Scheme, which was a key part of that legislation. And the purpose of that registration scheme is that any overseas actor in this country with the purpose of representing their country has to make that clear and register as a foreign actor in the country. If they do not do so and they're found to have been seeking to lobby for their country or indeed interfere in our politics in other ways, they have committed a criminal offence. That will only take effect now on the 1st of July. And within it, there are tiers. There's a standard tier and an enhanced tier. And as it stands, the government has only designated Russia and Iran as the enhanced tier, leaving China and other actors still at the standard level. So slowly, the government is starting to put in place some apparatus to address some of the challenges of disinformation. But it's not clear that that's fast enough, and it's not clear that it's keeping up with the threat that is posed. Labour government said in their manifesto last year that they would, on entering office, conduct a China audit, which would be intended to look at the operations of China in the UK and how China was impacting on UK interests. I and others are continuing to ask for the publication of that audit, which has not yet been forthcoming. And at the same time, partly in the context of the Trump administration, we see a steady flow of ministers to Beijing, and indeed the chief of the defence staff was there this week along with the trade minister, seeking to build bridges, build relationships with China, all the time not putting in front of the Parliament or the British public the government's assessment of the threat that China poses to us. So we have that on the security side, and then, as you know, we also have the Online Safety Act. When the Online Safety Act was introduced, foreign influence and interference was made a priority offence. So there's an attempt in that legislation around how people behave online to include aspects of the elements that were included in the National Security Act. My concern is that this framework is still fragile, that it is largely inadequate, and that to a high degree it puts too much responsibility in the hands of these social media companies rather than being bolder and braver to actually regulate effectively. Last piece of concern that I would share is that we've seen reports in the last 2 weeks as the UK government has scrambled to respond to the bullying behaviour from Donald Trump, that the government is prepared to put aspects of the Online Safety Act and, for that matter, the Digital Services Tax on the table as things that they will be willing to remove in order to curry favour with Donald Trump and his technology backers. To me, that's a grave source of concern. I don't think we should be trading our tax policy and our regulatory policy, which is intended to protect the functioning of our democracy as well as our young people online, for the financial interests of the US, however challenging the trade environment might be. I am far from being any kind of expert in the algorithms that govern our social media. But I think even a layperson thinking about those algorithms can identify a few key elements which I think are germane to what we're talking about here. So first of all, the question of what is said. And I think those of us on the progressive side of politics struggle with this, because we come right to the heart of freedom of speech, which is such an important part of the democratic values that we are protecting. So on the one hand, we have an instinct to say people should be free to express views, subject, of course, to the legal definitions of incitement of hatred and other things that tip over into criminal offence. The next question there is, who sees it? So those who are publishing to these platforms have the opportunity to disseminate it, but as we all know, how far it reaches is largely governed by the algorithms. And those algorithms are locked and very carefully protected by the social media companies, principally with the objective of generating interactions and therefore revenue for themselves. So unless governments are willing to actually get stuck in to looking at those things, rather than simply calling for the self-regulation of the industry, there is a problem about our ability to understand who is seeing things. And then the final point is reach. So if we take somebody like Elon Musk may have set up the algorithms of X to ensure that his posts are put in front of us all. But he, in a way, doesn't need to, because he has so many followers that anybody interacting with that will in its own way stimulate the algorithm to put it in front of other people. So we have these three elements: what is said, who it reaches, and who it is said by. And they are all worthy of consideration when we think about the right balance of regulation in a free society. Second area I want to touch on slightly more briefly is the harassment and intimidation of candidates. So as somebody who stood in a national election for the first time last year, I was acutely aware of this threat. In fact, at the Blavatnik School of Government, where I was previously, supported by the Landecker Foundation, a team had done a great deal of work on this aspect, and I was familiar with their studies. The Electoral Commission published research that showed that in the May 24 local elections, 43% of candidates said that they had experienced abuse or intimidation, and 10% self-described this as serious. When they were given some examples of what abuse and intimidation might amount to, a further 13% said, actually, I did experience that. So we can say it's between 43 and 56%. That is very aligned to the figures they then derived from the general election, where 55% of candidates said that they'd experienced abuse or intimidation. And of those, 13% said that the form that took was serious. On a scale of 1 to 5, they rated it as either 4 or 5. So we can see that there is real interference in our political process by people using intimidation and harassment to intimidate candidates who are taking part in the democratic process. And that is happening in real life and online. But really troublingly, this is not uniform. It is targeted at particular groups within the candidacy. So women and those of minority ethnic background are much more likely to be targeted. 56% of women in the local election last year who were candidates said that they would not campaign alone because they were intimidated by the environment in which they were campaigning. That compares to 19% of men. And 47% of women said that they would avoid discussing controversial topics, which relates to 20% of men. So we have this issue. First of all, we need a thriving democracy in which people of all backgrounds, all genders, and all ethnicities feel able to stand. And yet people are being intimidated in this way and discouraged from standing. Secondly, those who stand are experiencing genuine distress as a result of the level of harassment they're receiving, which not only is an issue for them and their well-being, but also a further discouragement to those who might stand in the future. And finally, those who do stand, and even those who are elected, are self-censoring what they talk about because they're so scared about what the online and in real life reaction might be. And this is just not acceptable. For those of you who want to look into it more, the Joe Cox Foundation has done excellent work in this area. And as I said, there are publications from the Blavatnik School and the Alfred Landecker Foundation. So just to leave you, I think as we think about these challenging topics, there are 3 questions that resonate for me. First is, who should regulate democracy? Now that's a huge question, but when we think about the online space, who is it that holds the responsibility there? Is it Ofcom, which was originally set up effectively as an economic regulator of the media industry? Is it the Electoral Commission as an arm-length body which reports into Parliament? But then you have the issue of who controls Parliament. So to Neal's point, I very much hope we won't be there. But if we had parties of a less progressive nature controlling Parliament, what could they do in the setting of the mandate to the Electoral Commission? And then the second question I'd want to ask is who defends democracy? I've already highlighted this question about the role of the agencies in looking at what's happening online. Are we comfortable with that? Do we have fears about that in terms of the secrecy that goes with those agencies? And is that a trade that we're willing to make? And finally, who should identify and regulate misinformation? You know, part of the disinformation approach that I described is contesting truth, is trying to challenge the heart of what truth looks like. And consequently, who we charge with assessing information is not a neutral question. But we need, I think, to get braver at confronting these questions and getting a bit more muscular about standing up for what an open and free democracy looks like and how we can regulate the information with that in an effective way so we can ensure the ongoing health of our democratic system. Thank you.
Very many thanks, Callum. That was fascinating. Right, I'd like to introduce our third speaker now. This is Isabel Clark. She's a lecturer in security and protection science in the Department of Linguistics and English Language at Lancaster University. Her research areas are sociolinguistics, corpus linguistics, discourse analysis, and computational linguistics. She's also written papers on Trump's tweets and the representation of Muslims and Islam in the UK press. So I'm hoping that Isabel will be able to give us a slightly more detailed picture of what's going on in the online world. Thanks.
Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about some of the strategies of mis and disinformation that I have covered across online and social media across 3 different research projects. Sorry, is this better? Okay. So I'm going to cover some research that I've, 3 different research projects looking at mis and disinformation online. Now, the first project I conducted this with Professor Jack Grieve at the University of Birmingham, and we looked at Donald Trump's tweets. And we were interested in how Trump's communicative style varied over time. And so we collected his tweets from 2009 to 2018 as we did this study in 2018. And we analysed his style using a technique that I've developed called short text multidimensional analysis. I'm not going to go into detail of what that was, but it's aimed at uncovering the most common patterns of stylistic variation across his tweets. And it does that by uncovering common patterns of grammatical features. I analysed Trump's tweets from 2009 to 2018, looking at how his style varied over time. And I revealed 4 dimensions of stylistic variation. And this revealed that Trump's tweets varied in terms of how conversational they were, how much campaigning, the degree of campaigning they included, the degree of engagement, and how advisory they were. Now, I'm just going to focus on the engagement style, and this pattern revealed that Trump's tweets varied according to how much engagement they included. And so when his tweets were engaged, they not only interacted with other people, but they also acknowledged other people's ideas and opinions of others. But when Trump's tweets were disengaged, he often gave his own categorical judgments about other people and events and institutions and policies, but without marking that they are subjective opinions, instead stating them as if they're just matters of fact. And so this is kind of where we have this area of stating something as if it's a matter of fact, but it's actually just an opinion. This is kind of this nuance with misinformation. Now, in many of his disengaged tweets, Trump stated something to be unambiguously true, even though at the time the claims were not generally accepted as true. So this disengaged style is certainly used by Trump to strategically push an alternative narrative. So that was Trump's tweets. My next project was for my PhD research, which I looked at trolling tweets. And if any of you don't know what trolling is, I can explain that. It's essentially people online, essentially trying to provoke an argument or provoke a response from people, and they say a variety of different things. And I was interested in how trolling tweets, the functions of trolling tweets vary and compare to ordinary, just general tweets. And I uncovered 4 dimensions of functional linguistic variation. Now, I'm also just going to focus on one communicative function, and this is informational broadcasts. And this was the most common pattern of linguistic variation that I found when comparing trolling tweets and general tweets. And I found that there was a considerable overlap between them, so they often employed this communicative function. Now, tweets, when they were associated with this function, they had an informationally dense style. So they packed lots of nouns, noun types, noun modifiers, and just incorporated lots of information, sharing different kind of press reportage and broadcasting that information across the internet and across Twitter. And they were just commenting on news, but sharing a lot of news information. And it's not possible through my analysis to tell how truthful they were, but many of the tweets associated with the trolling ones were false and misleading, just based on what was known at the time. And so as from this analysis, we can say that this kind of communicative style is used by trolling tweets to spread misleading information. But as I said, this function was also used by ordinary tweets, just to share information, and often this was truthful information. And so what I think is that because this repertoire is commonly used to spread truthful information, it helps to make that false information that the trolling tweets are trying to spread, it helps to make that just a bit more believable, because it's in that expected form that we would expect to see truthful information. Now, the final project I will briefly speak about is my most recent project, and this was funded by the Leverhulme Trust, and I've been looking at some funny spaces on the internet, looking at websites that are known to promote pseudoscience and conspiracy theories. And I collected text from several known websites. I think I had 250 different websites. And I was looking specifically at texts on these websites that mentioned vaccination, climate change, genetically modified organisms, and stem cells, as these kind of spark a lot of anti-science. And then I explored common representations, common discourses for each topic. And then I was interested in not just in the individual topics, but I was interested in what is shared between the topics. Now, I'll just focus on one shared discourse, but if you want to ask me more about them, I can address these in the Q&A. But the discourse that's shared across all topics is the idea that we are being lied to. And this discourse occurred in texts in relation to climate change by suggesting that by focusing on debates within climatology. So there are areas in climate science where there are debates and there's not necessarily full agreement, but that was then used to kind of say there is no consensus on anthropogenic global warming and climate change, and so as a result humans aren't making an impact on the climate. It was also used to say that the mainstream media their reports on climate change are sensationalistic and causing alarm, so we shouldn't believe that, we shouldn't do anything, it's not as bad as they're making it out to be. With regards to vaccines, we are being lied to was kind of demonstrated in many texts talking about infection and death rates, saying that they aren't as bad as they're making it out to be. They often say that the virus isn't that bad. It will actually make us strong through the natural antibodies that you make. They say that we're being lied to because vaccines are not safe or effective, and that they've caused various disorders and diseases, which we know that that's not true. With regards to stem cells, they talk about chemotherapy and radiation quite a lot, as they critique these therapies, as they say that it doesn't kill cancer stem cells, so they're pointless treatments, and we're being lied to just to kind of profit the big pharmaceutical companies. They also talk about stem cell therapy that's worked on an individual person to then say it definitely does work and it will work on everyone, and that we're being lied to, suggesting that it doesn't necessarily work on everyone. And then with regards to genetically modified organisms, they promote that GMOs are not safe and that we're being lied to that they are safe. And they specifically draw on particular companies like Monsanto to say that they've lied to us, and so they're still lying to us as well. Now, across all the shared discourses that I've found, we have, in my opinion, some very highly effective persuasive strategies. And these are downplaying and overstating the risks and the benefits. So, for instance, with regards to vaccines and viruses, the virus's risk is often downplayed as a way to suggest that we don't need the vaccines and that we don't need to have all these restrictions upon us, like lockdowns and social distancing and things like that. The risk of carbon dioxide is often downplayed, suggesting that we need it for life, and that it's therefore we don't need to worry about kind of reducing it. And if we do reduce it, that would have an even bigger impact on kind of life forms. Just by calling climate activists alarmists and the media sensationalistic, that leads to this idea that it's not as bad as they're making it out to be, which is kind of downplaying the actual risk of climate change. And by saying that, they often downplay the benefit of conventional medicine to say that you should just take natural supplements and things like that, because they say that conventional medicine isn't aimed at curing you. With regards to overstating the benefits and the risks, the vaccine side effects are often overstated to say that it will cause something, it will lead to different disorders like autism, and when we know that there are obviously side effects for vaccines, but they say that these are much more severe than they are. The benefits of CO2, as I said, these are often overstated as a way to kind of promote climate inaction. The promise of stem cells is overstated despite limited research. They suggest that just it works on one person, so it will work on everyone, and that's not the case. They often suggest that natural supplements will cure, treat and prevent all sorts of different ailments, and that is very much an overstatement. And they overstate that all GMOs are harmful. Now, what is the effect of these persuasive strategies? Well, I think the effect is the illusory truth effect, and this depicts that repeated information is often perceived as more truthful than new information. Now, something that's very important is that these anti-science websites, ones that promote pseudoscience and conspiracy theories, they repeat a lot. They are constantly repeating, recycling, regurgitating the same arguments over and over again across different websites, on the same websites over time. I mean, you could look back over time and find the same article just repeated over and over. It's just constant recycling and repeating. Now, I've uncovered through my research that not only is there lots of repetition across the different websites, but there's also these shared discourses that are repeated across topics. So the same idea that we are being lied to occurs for vaccines, occurs for stem cells, GMOs, and for climate change as well. And that just makes this all a bit more believable because they're hearing it again and again and again. So what are we up against? Well, I think we're up against 3 very highly effective and very persuasive strategies. The first is a simple strategy. The simple strategy is that they just make use of repetition, and repetition makes things much more easily believable. The second is that they pay homage to very subtle strategies. This downplaying and overstating isn't outright lying. They're not saying that climate change doesn't exist, but they're just saying that it's not as bad as they're making it out to be. And again, this makes it a lot more believable. And finally, the last strategy is a simulated strategy. By employing similar communicative styles and communicative functions as that people use in order to spread truthful and accurate information, this makes it a lot more difficult for the ordinary person to delineate fact from fiction. So simple, subtle, and simulated strategies. And that's everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. That actually consolidated for me kind of suspicions one has about these methods that are used to spread false information. Our next speaker is Mark Thomas. Mark is the founder of the organisation 99% and is a visiting professor at the IE Business School. He's the author of The Complete CEO, The Zombie Economy, and 99%, Mass Impoverishment and How We Can End It, which was a Financial Times best book in 2019. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Claire. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So I'm going to talk about defensive constitutional reform. I'm particularly interested in defensive constitutional reform in the UK, but I'm actually going to start by talking about the US, because I'm afraid there are some important lessons for us. So if we just look at what's happening right now in the US, it's absolutely extraordinary. First of all, we have a regime which is taking a chainsaw both to US democracy and to the US social contract. So in terms of democracy, they're systematically removing checks and balances, ignoring court judgments, talking about activist judges, bringing in legislation to restrict the power of judges to review executive things. We can see that they are ignoring due process. People are being snatched off the streets and sent to El Salvador with no due process at all. That's an extraordinary thing to be happening. They're already restricting the freedom of academic research, and they're threatening those in the media who are attempting to hold them to account and to be critical. So all of those checks and balances are being very, very aggressively dismantled right as we speak. And what's happening to the social contract is equally scary. Doge was created, it's an unelected body, but with extraordinary power to dismember parts of the state apparatus. So, for example, they've already, to a large extent, erased black and female history from every federal rule, from military sites, etc. They have ceased funding to progressive organisations, including the Office of Domestic Climate Change Policy. They've abolished, well, they're in the process of abolishing the Department of Education. They're attacking Medicare and Medicaid. They're attacking benefits, including SNAP, supplementary nutrition, in other words, food vouchers for people who need food. They're banning books. They're weakening unions. In Florida, they are introducing legislation to liberalize child labor. So if that goes through, it will be legal for school children to be working overnight on the day before they go to school for up to 8 hours, and they won't even have the right to a break every 4 hours. This is, as the FT said, this is going back to the 1800s. Why are they doing all of this? Because if they can cut all of these costs, they're aiming for 5.3 trillion in tax cuts. And of course, the principal beneficiary of tax cuts will be the very wealthy. So it is absolutely shocking. And that's before we get on to all the things that are happening in terms of realigning geopolitics, aligning with Putin on Ukraine and on tariffs, threatening UK members with annexation of their territories. They've already withdrawn from the UNHCR. They've already ended funding for the World Health Organization. So these are truly unthinkable things. And of course, they abolished US aid. What I find scary is that the previous administration had a lot of warning about this. The Mueller report after the 2016 election said very clearly that there had been Russian interference. There's no question about that. Trump stacked the Supreme Court and they then gave him presidential immunity. There's no question about that. That was obvious. There was an insurrection in January 2021. There's no question about that. That was obvious. Musk in 2022 bought Twitter and corrupted it. I think not even just for personal gain in the short-term sense, but actually, I think he lost money on the purchase, but he gained enormous political influence. And as you say, he was able to build up to 200 million followers. And of course, he made a 250 million donation to the Trump campaign. All of that was obvious. And what did the Biden administration do to protect US democracy? Well, they didn't really do anything to prevent foreign interference. They did nothing at all, as far as I can see, to control this industrial scale disinformation. They didn't make any restrictions on political donations, and there's not even any restriction on having criminals standing for high office in the United States. And of course, the result is there are a lot of criminals in very high office now. They also didn't put in any restrictions on what an incoming government would be able to do after an election should it win. So there's no restriction that says a government in the US cannot act against the interests of 99% of the population. There was no strengthening of the separation of powers, for example, the power of the courts to hold the executive to account, no strengthening of academic and press freedom, and no effective protection at all against abuse of presidential powers. Now, I'm sorry to have talked so much about the states, but the reason I wanted to do that is because I think there are some lessons for us. It's very, very plausible that exactly the same thing could happen here. We have a largely unwritten constitution which relies on what Lord Hennessy called the good chaps theory of government. And in practice, what that means is that we don't have any defensive measures in place. So pre-election, we have no control really over foreign interference. There's something maybe starting now. We have absolutely no control over this industrial scale of disinformation. We have no effective restriction. There are some restrictions on political donations, but they're not effective. And there are no restrictions on criminals standing for office. You can't, I think, stand as an MP if you're bankrupt, but otherwise, as far as I can see, there's no real restriction. And perhaps equally importantly, post-election, there's no control on what an incoming government could do if it manages to get itself elected. There's nothing to stop a government acting against the interests of 99% of the population. The separation of powers hasn't been strengthened, academic freedom isn't strengthened, and there's no protection against what 50 years ago Lord Hailsham warned us about. He used the phrase elective dictatorship, saying there's really no protection in the UK against us electing a prime minister who wants to act as a dictator. We've had 50 years of warning, we've done nothing. But we've also had a lot of recent practical warnings, just like the States. With Brexit, Callum mentioned the warnings that we had from the ISC about Russian interference, but we also know very well about the interference of organizations like Cambridge Analytica and Facebook conspiring to it wasn't just industrial scale disinformation, it was very, very sophisticated, targeted to the individual information. It was military grade psychological operations targeted at the individual. We had that warning, we know that, that's a fact. Johnson and Cummings systematically removed checks and balances. So we are now one of few countries in Europe that doesn't really have the right to peaceful protest. And we saw not very long ago, just a week or so ago, a Quaker meeting house, perhaps having a meeting rather like this one, was stormed by the police because they had reasonable suspicion that they might be planning some kind of disruptive protest. Well, that's pretty scary, actually. So they removed that one. They removed that right of peaceful protest. They purged the civil service. They introduced a judicial review bill in an attempt to restrict the power of judicial review. They want to reduce the power of whistleblowers. And they even went so far as proroguing, it was reversed, but they did go so far as proroguing Parliament to stop parliamentary scrutiny of what they were up to. All of that is fact. We know this. We know that Musk is now currently using his account to attack the government, to say that civil war in Europe and in the UK is inevitable, etc. We know that he offered $100 million to Farage. We also know that there's a group called Resolute 1850, which is seeking US funding for Farage. They've already pledged him $1 million. Well, we don't know exactly what's going on with his funding, but we know somebody's funding him now because his net worth is estimated at around $4 million, which is quite good, but it's not enough to enable you to spend £150,000 every month on Facebook advertisements. That dwarfs the combined spending of all the other parties in the UK. Somebody is funding him lavishly right now. So we've had the warnings. And although it's very clear, I think, that the world and the UK has many people who are not good chaps, our government currently seems to think and has said that constitutional matters are more of an issue for the second term. So 99%, we set up a project on defensive constitutional reform to try to prevent what is happening today in the United States from happening in the UK in 4 years' time. We don't believe that a second term is a foregone conclusion. If you look at history, you would say it's kind of a foregone conclusion because it's very, very rare that anybody would lose a majority of this size. But as the Compass report, the Thin Ice report points out, this is a very different kind of majority, and the world is just very, very different in general. So we think that there's actually something like a 40% chance of a very far-right party winning the next election. And so there's a very significant chance of, after the next election, something like Project 2025 being implemented here. We're effectively, by not acting, we're effectively playing Russian roulette with British democracy and the British social contract. But we're playing Russian roulette with two loaded chambers. That is not something, that is not a risk that any sane person would want to take. So we, in conjunction with several other organisations, are trying to raise awareness in government and outside of those risks. We can still act. There's still time to act. We could put in place protections before an election. We could control dark money in politics. That wouldn't be too difficult, and the government is actually thinking a bit about that. We could put in control over disinformation. As we've heard, that one is much more difficult, but it is absolutely vital. If you lose the idea of truth, you really are going to lose the idea of democracy. You can strengthen campaign fraud investigation and penalties, and you could disbar parties if they're egregiously breaching the rules. At the moment, the Electoral Commission has the power to fine them £20,000 or something. Well, if they've got somebody whose net worth is 200 billion backing them, they're not going to be unduly put off by that. You could reform the voting system. And it's not really a constitutional reform, but very, very importantly, you could make sure you're delivering on the promise of national renewal. When we estimated the probability of a far-right government, we looked at the sensitivities. Quite a big sensitivity is whether, at the time of the election, this government is perceived to have delivered. And if it isn't, the probability of a far-right government goes up a long way. And they should be putting in constitutional safeguards after an election, increasing the separation of powers, undoing some of the things that Cummings was working on, constitutional protection, requiring a supermajority to overturn them, to make sure that we have an independent judiciary, independent civil service, independent academic research, and independence of regulators, in particular the Electoral Commission. So there are things that can be done. We need to get the government to do them as a matter of urgency. Second term may be an illusion. It needs to happen now. It needs to happen well before a campaign starts. So this is, if anything is urgent, this is urgent. So if you're not already members of 99%, please do join us. It's an all-volunteer organisation, so it doesn't cost anything to join, but we do ask people to help by spreading the message and by getting involved in these projects that we run. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think you really sort of consolidated why we're all here, our anxieties, as is everybody else in their own different ways. Our final speaker today is Tom Brake. Tom was elected as MP for Carshalton and Wallington in 1997 and was a government minister between 2012 and 2015. He is now the director of Unlock Democracy, a membership organisation which campaigns for democratic reforms in the UK, including proportional representation and House of Lords reform.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Compass, for organising the event today. And I just wanted to start by saying my commiserations to Isabel. The thought of having to analyse Donald Trump's tweets and then look at 250 conspiracy websites, the mind boggles at the impact that has on someone. So, commiserations. What I'm going to say probably follows on fairly neatly from what Mark was talking about in terms of some measures which I think the government can take very soon, particularly around the elections bill, which they are promising will be with us probably a white paper or a statement before the summer recess, and then sometime in the next session, not quite sure when that's going to be, but an elections bill in the next session. But before coming on to that, I suppose I wanted to ask you the question whether you think there is a crisis in terms of democratic engagement. And I think what Neal was saying at the beginning, I think reinforces that point, and I think some nods in the audience do as well. And if you look at some of the most recent statistics, so the fact that the general election turnout 60%, a very low turnout for a general election. If you look at the fact that there are 8 million people who are eligible to vote in UK elections but are not actually on the electoral register, I think that's also a significant sign of disengagement. If some of you may have seen that report from Channel 4, 52% of 13 to 27-year-olds believe that the country needs a strong man. I guess it probably would be a strong man, and someone who doesn't need to worry about Parliament. Now, if 52% of 13 to 27-year-olds think that, I think that is also a very significant sign of disengagement. And regrettably, there are many other statistics of this nature. So 16 to 17-year-olds, so attainers, so people who are going to go on the register to be there so they can vote when they're 18. In 2015, 45% of 16 to 17-year-olds were registered, so they could vote when they reached 18. Now it's 16% by 2022. So I think across all of the statistics, there is very clearly an issue with engagement in politics, voting, representative democracy. So what can we do about this? So there are some very concrete things that the government can do, and some of them they've indicated they are going to do, and we will support them on that, and I know a lot of the other political parties will do as well. So given that will be in the elections bill, and we very much welcome that. That's about, I think, boosting engagement, particularly if it's linked to decent education. So votes to 16, very much support that, and it will work as long as it is linked to decent citizenship education, so that 16-year-olds understand what it's about and why it's worth doing, why they don't perhaps want a strong man running the country as opposed to living in a democracy. Then there's automatic voter registration. So those 8 million people that I referred to who are not on the electoral register but are legitimate voters who could be voting. Automatic voter registration is the answer to that. Now the government are sort of a dance of the veils, really, in terms of whether they are going to do it or whether they're not going to do it. It's quite complicated, might be quite expensive. Maybe they'll do some really simple things. So the most obvious thing to do is to, when you apply for a passport or when you apply for a driving license, at that point, your data, and there are some privacy issues, your data is handed over to the electoral registration officer in the area your address is from, and then they put you on the electoral register automatically. So no longer filling in that form that comes around in October. Actually, you go on the register automatically, unless that you are a vulnerable person, and in those circumstances you wouldn't be put on. Otherwise, you're put on automatically, and then you're able to take part in elections. And the benefit from that, or one of the benefits, or maybe perhaps for some people it might be a disbenefit, is that the political parties will start knocking on your door. Because I know, and I'm sure Callum knows, and other politicians know, that if there's a door and there's no name, you're not going to knock there. Why would you? You're not going to capture any data about them, so you won't know what their views are. But if they're on the electoral register now, those 8 million people, then politicians will be knocking on their door and trying to find out who they are and listen to their views. So I think that would improve, I think, engagement. Also, perhaps more controversial, extending voting rights to a wider range of group of people. Many organisations, including ours, support the idea that there are people who've lived in the UK for their whole lives. They might not be UK citizens or Commonwealth citizens, but they still, we think, should be entitled to vote. Now, so you get people on the register, and then you need ways of boosting voter engagement. A number of people, earlier speakers, have referred to the role that proportional representation could play to do that, because it means votes equal seats. And that is a pretty convincing argument, I would say, for most people, particularly if you have, in a series of elections, seen your vote not actually help to deliver a seat at all. And I still meet people who say, I've lived in this area for my whole life, and I've never yet actually voted for a candidate that I succeeded in getting elected. And with proportional representation, they would do that. The citizens' assemblies and the engaging people in the policy-making process, I think that would be a way of boosting voter engagement. If people feel that the opportunity to express a view isn't just once every 4 or 5 years in the ballot box, but actually there are opportunities either at a national level or at a local level, and many authorities, including Oxford, are doing this, of engaging people in citizen assemblies so they are participating, active participants in decisions that affect them. I think that's another way of boosting voter engagement. Big money in politics has been mentioned. If you want people to feel that their views are being heard, what you don't want is parties, and it's all across the board, the parties being funded mainly by donors who are donating £100,000 or more. And whatever a politician says, that donor is getting something for their money. What they're getting at the very least is that when a donor who has donated £100,000 or more calls or emails and says, I want to speak to the Member of Parliament, they're going to get that access. Far easier than the person who hasn't donated £100,000. So it does have influence, whatever anyone says. So by taking big money out of politics, capping the amount that can be donated, actually what that will force the parties to do, and in Canada's a good example of this, they then have to go and talk to and attract far more members to their party, and therefore far more smaller donors. So you break the the stranglehold in some respects that those really big donors have on our political parties. And perhaps the final thing to mention is just the issue of tackling the lack of trust in politicians. And I think this was an area where we were expecting fairly immediate action from the new government. Some of you will have heard this idea that the government were going to introduce an Ethics and Integrity Commission. It was talked about a lot in opposition, but I don't know where it's gone. I haven't heard anything about the Ethics and Integrity Commission really for the last 6 months. I hope it will happen. And if that Ethics and Integrity Commission had been in place 6 months ago, it's possible that some of the stories we are still seeing about ministers taking freebies wouldn't be in the news. Now, sometimes when my organisation runs campaigns around this, I'm attacked for freebies, that's a silly issue, it doesn't really matter, it's not big, it's not sort of geopolitics. But unfortunately, the public do actually worry about it, and it adds to their feeling of mistrust in politicians if they see someone, for the sake of argument, the Chancellor, taking a series of freebies which other people would never have the opportunity to have offered to them and couldn't afford to pay for them themselves. So I think I would just conclude by saying that the things that I've outlined, I think separately, none of these, I think, would ensure that our democracy was safe from the sort of onslaught that we've seen American democracy undergo under Trump and his supporters. But I think if we took them all together, then I think they would have a real impact in terms of building the resilience of our democracy. And I look forward to what's going to come after, I think, in the workshops, where maybe we will agree to work on some of these things and make sure they are delivered for the benefit of our democracy. Thank you.
Well, many thanks to Tom and to our entire panel. I think they all deserve another round of applause as a unit.
Thank you so much for all the questions. It was really much harder than we thought to pick a variety, and we prioritised picking ones that covered as many different topics as possible. And there's a lot of people's questions who we sort of, all those two are both really good, but they overlap the same topic. So we've just picked one of them that was maybe the shorter one, and get in as many as we can. So for all the questions, if you did want to read them out, we'll just decide to get more in, we'll just read all of them out for you, but we'll read your name if you've given it. And some of the questions are for a particular panellist, and some of them, panellists, if you would like to sort of put your hand up if you would like to answer that question that's more on your particular topic. So to start with, this might be for Neal, but I'll let you decide.
So the question was from Christopher Lawson, where will the young people at this meeting, combined with how do we reach outside the demographic present here today? So, very key question, I think.
Anyway, well, clearly, you know, me and Isabel are sitting on the youthful wing of the. I would have thought that was just blindingly obvious. Isabel's a little bit older than me, but you know, but there you go. We get this a lot, you know, and there is something about, you know, so Compass and, you know, and Unlock and, you know, and Mark's 99%, you know, and politics generally, you know, for political parties. The notion of joining something and paying a subscription is quite an old-fashioned kind of way of doing politics. You know, today obviously people do politics in this fashion. It's fleeting, it's quick, you know, you can get these kind of, you know, big movements going, whether it's, you know, hashtag Me Too or Black Lives Matter or, you know, etc., etc. You know, the notion of membership and coming to meetings like this and having, you know, intellectual, ideological conversations which are absolutely necessary doesn't quite fit, I don't think. I'm not saying, you know, younger people aren't intellectual, they clearly are. But you know, we are where we are, say Compass and other organisations are membership organisations, and you tend to attract a certain wonderful, beautiful demographic for being, and that really matters. And of course I want young people here, and I think young people are really political. I think it's really fragile where they are now, as Tom was saying, those figures, because as I was saying earlier, everyone knows that the system's broken, right? Everyone, apart from, other than Callum, and some, people in the Liberal Democrats and some people in the Labour Party, and God bless them, the Greens, know that the system is broken and we need to change it dramatically. And young people know that. They know that in their lives about the precariousness of their jobs, their lack of pension, their lack of ever getting on the housing ladder, the looming crisis which will sweep them of climate change. They know all of this stuff, right? And they want big answers, okay? They're right to want big answers. And they will go to the people that give them big answers. A few years ago they went to Corbyn, quite rightly, because he was preaching a politics of big answers. And now Nigel Farage is preaching a politics of big answers. And even if they don't like him as a person and know he's a charlatan, at least he's saying the system is broken. So I think we have to have a language, and God bless our older organisations that will attract, a certain demographic, because that really matters. The fact that older people join, I don't know what Tom's demographic is for Unlock, but in Compass, thank God that older people join and pay, and then we can recruit young people like Luke at the back that can do all the work to build the institutions, to do the stuff, right? And it really matters, right? So join Mark's 99%, join Unlock and join Compass and support those organisations that can do these campaigns. And let's try and find ways, which we've got to do, of talking about and with younger people in ways that they understand, in ways that will kind of, energise them. And it's our job as older generations. I was kidding about me being young. I don't think you realise, let's kind of, find a way of giving those people the space and the hope and the possibility of changing this stuff, and recognising that it is progressive change that is going to kind of really do this stuff, not the regressive, horrible, hateful, politics of Farage. So two things, let's open ourselves up to that stuff, let's make it work as best we can, but let's not kick ourselves for being old and building brilliant and good institutions like those represented here today, because they really matter and they're really important. So let's do both of those things.
So this next question was quite specific, we thought, but also we think it really draws out, or can potentially draw out, a lot of very general questions and considerations for us today as well. So this is a question for Isabel. So presumably Trump and people in a similar situation do not write their own tweets. Is it possible to tell when there are discrete changes in the style of the language or grammar in ways that suggest to who the real people behind these tweets are? And I think have they changed? Can we sort of track these sorts of changes? So.
Thank you for that question. We actually did track, as part of that paper, we tracked, there were two phones that were being used at the time throughout the 2008 to 2018 period. There was an Android and an iPhone, and we did find there were disparities between the styles that were used. We found, especially for the iPhone, which we anticipate was used by his team, they employed a bit more of a campaigning style. It was like, oh, we're here in Nevada today, God bless you all, we love you, can't wait for a fantastic day. Those sorts of kinds of tweets. But we also we found that what we anticipate was actually Trump speaking and tweeting. His tweets occurred more in the morning and in the evening. And obviously they were these kinds of those disengaged styles, a bit more kind of sharing his opinion as if it was matter of fact. But yeah, I mean, I specialise in a technique called authorship analysis, where I can tell who has written a tweet. We haven't looked at that specifically with Trump's tweets, but it is possible to explore that. And I think, but yeah, I think we do have to consider who is writing these tweets. So we actually had the conversation with the person that I think has written that question, and we were talking about things like Elon Musk and whether he writes his own tweets and things. I think we have to assume, yes, he does write some, but he doesn't write all, and I think they just think that they are these powerful, very powerful individuals, and they just want to share their kind of thoughts with everyone, and they do, and yeah. I hope that answers the question. I don't know if
this question is from Isabel Tucker, and it's probably a question of Callum or Tom, whoever wants to put that in. What can be done to strengthen regulators like Ofcom? They seem to have very limited remits and are poorly resourced at the present.
I'll start Tom's scribbling notes, so he'll give you a more considered answer in a second. Across the regulatory frame, we have a number of regulators who are not as strong as they need to be, and you could look to Ofwat in the water world as much as to Ofcom has been mentioned. Ultimately, they draw their power from the legislation that's put them in place, and that's the democratic control on what they're there for. A number of these, and I would include both the ones I've mentioned in scope, were set up, as you know, with forms of privatisation and regulation in the 1980s, with a particular model of what should be done. And thinking of those, it was particularly around trying to ensure that a quasi-market for what were fundamentally some form of monopolies were maintained, and so often that was to do with the economic and the price side. But increasingly, I think democratically, we want to see these regulators doing more when it comes to the quality of the outcomes of the industries or the outputs for which they're responsible. And honestly, there's then a tension, and Neal mentioned it a little bit earlier on when he spoke about, in the economic realm, the Bank of England and the Office of Budget Responsibility. There's an issue here, which is that on the one hand, we want to reach for a regulator and say this regulator should sort of get involved and make sure that the media companies are behaving themselves, or the water companies are behaving themselves. But on the other hand, they are arm's length from government. They are notionally under one department or another, but fundamentally they are then charged with taking their own decisions. So we either have to get the mandate very precisely right in what is often a dynamic situation, or we need to be quite smart about how we have a tighter, in my view, link of democratic accountability between these regulators and, say, Parliament. So typically they respond to Parliament through their ministry. I think there's a case in more of these to have direct accountability for the regulators to Parliament, so that a democratically elected body can actually hold them to account. And that would be the best way, in my view, of getting that right balance. You could have a tighter set of requirements, maybe a mandate that is reviewed by Parliament every couple of years, but in that respect it could be more dynamic and, I would hope, more democratically accountable.
Thank you. I'd just add to that what would also help is having tighter regulations. And I can give you a couple of examples of that. Some of you may be aware of a campaign that Channel 4 are running, where they're suggesting that anything on social media should or could come with a trust mark, for instance, the equivalent to a kite mark, so if you saw it, you know that it came from a reliable source. They're advocating that the large language models, so the means of generating AI responses and so on, should actually be trained on public sector or public service media, so they're learning from sources that are bona fide sources, and that the algorithms should prioritise publishing or giving people access first to public sector media, so that that you know that what you're getting is of a reasonable quality. And the final thing that I would argue for is making social media publishers in the way that newspapers are, so then there would be some comeback if they willy-nilly were publishing material that was known to be completely false.
Okay, this question is from Phil White, it's directed to Neal. Which is the greater risk for Labour? 1, press public outcry if they break their fiscal rules, or 2, the risk of non-delivery?
Look, come the next election, there is only one issue on the table, and that's people's living standards. I mean, at the moment, I don't know what's around the corner, and that's the thing about politics now, you don't know. Wars, etc., etc. But at the moment, everything will be, they promise change, particularly, in terms of living standards. And if they don't deliver on that, and I think people have already given up on them. I mean, we talk about Progressive Alliance in Compass, and the thing you get back all the time is, look, these people are no longer progressive. When you get to the situation, if the Tories cut disabled people's benefits, at least we can vent our fury, right? We can get mad with them and say, we can demonstrate on the streets. When Labour do it, it just breaks your heart and makes you despondent. And they're playing with absolute fire on this stuff, right? Because it isn't just like, they come in, they break their promises, they do, the stuff they're not supposed to do, they do what the Tories would do, or even worse, because they can get away with it and the Tories wouldn't. Someone was arguing in the week that the Tories wouldn't have cut benefits because, it would be too much outrage about it, but Labour can somehow get away with it. But in terms of promising change at the last election, and saying things were going to get better, and then delivering the exact opposite, and things are getting worse. It's not just Labour that's going to lose the next election, it's democracy that's going to lose. Because if democracy doesn't put more food on people's tables that are hungry, then where are they going to go? And what do you expect people to do if nothing changes and nothing gets better, right? And that's what brings me into politics and gets me up to Oxford today, and the same as Callum and everyone on this platform and everyone in this room. We know that we're now dicing with death, that this isn't some benign kind of, movement between Labour and the Tories or whatever else. This is fascism, which is going to be at the door. So if they don't deliver, if they don't recognise when they say the world is changing, and they don't bloody well change, and they don't break their treasury orthodoxy or their stupid fiscal rules that are just based on momentary movements in the bond price, in the yields, this is nonsense stuff, right? Stop it. Recognise the world has changed. Recognise that you can get rid of those fiscal rules. You can run things in different ways. You can borrow more money. You can do what Germany's just done and has broken its post-war, debt break, because change. The world has moved on, and we now have to move on with it. And that's why people in the Labour Party and people outside of the Labour Party and everywhere have now got to get up and say, we're not going to put up with this. It's not good enough. We have to deliver more and better, and we have to put food on the table of people that are hungry, and we can't cut disabled people's benefits. What are we thinking of, right? So let's kind of steel ourselves to do that, and know, as we've been talking all afternoon, that there is a progressive majority in this country that want that kind of politics. And if there's a few people in the top of the Labour Party that are determined to make reform, and cut and deregulate, then, we have to pressure those people into changing, or we have to change those people. And now this is really serious. It's really important. So that's why we've got to do this work.
Yes, I agree very strongly with what Neal said there. If we don't get those changes, we will go the way of the states. It is fascism at the door. It is playing Russian roulette with two loaded chambers. I think it's one thing that I would add is that I think Labour are a prisoner of their electoral strategy. They got elected because they had a small target strategy. They said, we're not going to say anything that will give red meat to the tabloids or to the right wing. And that worked. And it worked for a couple of reasons, but one very obvious reason, which I don't think they've quite woken up to, it worked because they weren't responsible for the mess that the country's in. So if they just sat there and said nothing, people said, well, it's not their fault, we'll give them a chance. At the time of the next election, that major part of their strategy, that major plank in their strategy will not be there. They will be responsible, and I very much fear that what Neal said will come to pass. So until they until their strategists wake up to the fact that that major plank in the strategy is no longer present and can't be present. There's a real risk that they think they're playing it safe when actually they are taking an enormous risk with our social contract and with our democracy.
Continuing with the theme of democracy and elections, this is a question for the entire panel from Rosalind Kent. So it's two questions actually which are very closely linked. So which country has the most representative variety of PR, and how can we adopt this variety as soon as possible?
Did you see how the microphone was handed down? So, I mean, the first thing to say about PR is that we try to focus on the fact we're trying to get rid of a really unfair system called first past the post. The moment we get into discussions about a particular form of PR versus another form of PR, then for anyone outside this audience, and possibly some in this audience, and possibly some on this panel, people's eyes start to glaze over, and you then have completely lost the argument. So the focus is on, we have a first past the post voting system that saw Labour secure 64% of the seats on the basis of 34% of the votes, and the next time round, I think as Neal was saying, the outcome could be a Conservative Reform alliance achieving exactly the same thing with an informal stand down of Reform in certain seats and informal stand down of the Conservatives in other seats, and we then end up with a Reform-led government with 64% of the seats on 34% of the vote. So I think the focus has to be on getting rid of first past the post. However, in terms of how do we get to a change in the electoral system to a system that is a proportional and fair system where each vote counts, then the work that the all-party parliamentary group, working with Make Votes Matter, working with Unlock Democracy, Compass, to promote the idea of a national commission that the government would set up and back and support, that would look at electoral reform, is probably the easiest way we can sell this to a Labour Party in which the leadership is implacably opposed to proportional representation. So the National Commission is the way forward.
Yeah, and I just think it's, and I always agree with everything the top right says. Always. Look, it's really important that everyone understands why, particularly at the top of the Tory party, and much to my shame the Labour Party, why they support first past the post. So you have to understand, why they strongly back it and they don't want proportional representation. In the Labour Party, they want it because it gives them immense coercive power. Because under first past the post, it kind of means it'll either be Labour or the Tories, right? And in that position, it's very hard. It makes them strong internally within the Labour Party in terms of its membership, because you might as well not go and join another party because they're not going to get elected into office, right? So it keeps people in the Labour Party, and it disciplines voters to say, however bad things are, you'll vote for the least worst option, you hold your nose, you've got nowhere else to go. So it gives the leaders of the party immense power. Why would they introduce competition into the market where votes count equally and new start-ups could happen, the Labour Party would split into different bits just as the Conservative Party would split into different bits, and maybe the Liberal Democrats would, as well, because they're being forced together under first past the post. So I say that because we have to recognise that if we want to change the system, then we've got to be really determined to do it. And I think obviously a hung parliament is an opportunity where that could happen. Because what the Labour Party bureaucrats want to do is present to you a case at the next election where, and they'll say, we know you don't like us, but it's either Starbucks or whoever it is, or it is Farage. It's the lesser of two evils, right? And do you know what the lesser of two evils is? Well, you know what it is, right? It's not good enough. And I think one of the interesting tests about politics between now and the next election is how many people will vote for Callum and the Liberal Democrats, or vote for the Greens, or vote for the SNP, or vote for independents, because they're fed up of being put in that position of the least worst option. And they know that the system is broken, and they would rather vote with their hearts than their heads and vote for something they believe in. And that's again why they're playing, in Mark's parlance, Russian roulette with our politics, because then that point Farage gets in. If you watch Farage closely, he's edging further and further away from PR, which was good for reform when they were getting, 14% of the vote but less than 1% of the seats. And then first past the post kicks in and doesn't disadvantage you, but advantages you massively when you get up into the high 20s or early 30s, when you can do this thing about winning the majority of seats on 30-odd% of the vote. And Farage can see that. And why Labour, as everyone's been saying today, is playing, that Russian roulette, when that could happen in our country, and they won't change the voting system because they would rather have the power of coercing people and forcing people and blackmailing people into voting for them. And I think it's a horrible politics. It's a really horrible, nasty politics, and we've got to do better than that.
This question from Lewis Caldwell in Compass, Berkshire. What can we do to combat disinformation and political disillusionment in our, and I've underlined, local communities? Anyone like to tackle that one?
I think it's an analogue as well as a digital response. So I and many other campaigners spend a lot of our time actually trying to see people face to face. And there's lots of evidence if you go into the engagement data. Most parties will tell you that having a contact with a voter before an election has a much, much higher proportional chance of them turning out to vote for you at that election than putting a piece of paper through their door, and certainly then attracting them to a Facebook post. So part of it is the old-fashioned thing of just genuine human engagement. Tom talked earlier about making social media companies publishers. One of the things we haven't talked about, I suppose, is accountability for the information that's placed online. And I remember being struck about 8 years ago before her death. Shirley Williams came and gave a talk at the Biographies school, and someone asked Shirley, what should we do about the toxic environment in social media then? And she, in a wonderful way, was just very sanguine about it, and talked about the pamphleteers in the coffee houses of London and how that was just as much of a crisis. And the solution to that was to force everyone to have an imprint where you were accountable for what you published. And this business of anonymity online is a huge issue. People are very prepared to publish nonsense and to be, back to my point of earlier about the harassment and abuse of candidates, to do all of that when they're hidden behind the veil of anonymity. So I think it's one of the issues that we do really need to take on with the social media companies. I don't know which platforms you're all on. I've stopped posting on X and using Blue Sky now. I'm not 100% sure that Blue Sky is better, but at least it's not owned by Elon Musk. However, that just shows the speed with which that took over as an alternative platform. It shows it is possible to switch platforms. And what if we had a platform that made it a condition of participation that you provided some actual identifiers, a photograph, some degree of who you were? Perhaps people who wanted to go and look for truthful information would be more happy to do that in an environment where there was some accountability for it. So I don't have all the answers, but there are some sort of crumbs in there as to ways we might approach it in order to stimulate a higher level of engagement and trust.
Perhaps just to add that there are things I think that we can all do at a local level, and local politicians can do at a local level. And some of you may be familiar with the work done by an organisation called Compassionate Politics, which is trying to encourage politicians to treat each other in a respectful manner, obviously challenging, of course, but to try to take the heat out of things. And that's all something that we can do individually in terms of our responses, not having a knee-jerk response and thinking through the implications of what you have just sent to someone. If you were to then sort of revisit it 5 minutes later, I think sometimes you then adjust what you were going to send just because it's having reread it, it is more aggressive or more unpleasant perhaps than you thought initially. Anyone else want to go this?
Some of you may have encountered the platform Nextdoor. I personally find it to be one of the more toxic environments, but I did meet the chief executive a while back, and she claimed that they had been doing some things in their own work to try to encourage what I'm describing. So literally, as a platform, looking at keyboard stroke speeds on the basis that when you're angry you type faster, doing some linguistic work on the choice of words, and essentially popping up and saying, are you sure you want to post this? And genuinely forcing the user to wait 30 seconds before they hit send. So, the stuff that we can all do individually, but I mean, whilst that might sound like a trivial example, and as I say, in my experience, which is very limited because I didn't like it the first time, of interacting with Nextdoor, I'm not sure it's working, but nevertheless, there are things that we could challenge the companies to do that are, entirely voluntary on their side, but nevertheless would have an impact, if you like, on the civility of discourse.
This question fits well. That's true.
Yeah.
Claire. So I'm just going to... Is Trump's sort of actions and social media increasing support of, do we know about follow-up and engagement tweets in sort of the UK? Or is it perhaps showing a backfiring in a little bit? Do we know anything about that kind of...
Sorry, what is the question?
Sorry, so in terms of people's responses to sort of Trump's tweets in the UK, so sort of comments underneath, is some of his strategies sort of backfiring with people who would normally be on his side in other countries, like in the UK? Does what works for gaining support in the US, maybe on things like Greenland, actually encourage, and Canada encourage sort of his and increase support for his opponents in other countries?
I can't tell you the answer to that, but I can assume that. But again, this would have to be verified. But when we did our analysis, and that was obviously the tweets during 2008 to 2018, so lots has happened since then. But he had a very strategic style, and it varied according to who he was communicating with and particular events. If he was communicating with his Republican base, he often employed a bit more of an informal conversational style. When he was trying to attract Democratic voters, he would then employ a bit more of a formal, kind of less conversational style, a bit more informational. And we just know, I think we can assume that if he's trying to win the UK voters on side, he will be strategic in that way. We can't, but that is yet to be found out. I think I come from a different perspective. I think he's an idiot, so I struggled to see how people could listen to him and think he's brilliant, because it's really not.
Can I just abuse my position as being the executive director of Compass at this Compass event, because I've got a disappearance because my goddaughter's 21st in London and I've got to get back for it, being the good godparent I am. And I just want to say something about Trump and Farage and where that stuff is, because they, obviously they're incompetent when it comes to government. They're incompetent at least in governing for the majority. I don't know how much, Trump's, golden elite are going to benefit from him or not, and clearly he's doing things to help them. But that isn't the question, right? I read again and again when columnists say that we've reached the high point of populism. We've only ever reached the high point of populism when progressives fail to govern effectively. Because if we, in America, the Democrats could get back in, and you see the replacement of populists in Europe for short periods of time. But unless we can get to grips with changing our democracy and running the economy, on the basis of what the needs of the 99%, as Mark would put it, then the populists are going to keep coming back. Whether it's Farage or whether it's Trump or Orban, whoever it is, only when we have worked out how to transform our economy and our democracy will we stop populism and these kinds of people. So it's always our responsibility. Yes, they're idiots. Yes, they're going to mess up or whatever. But if democracy doesn't work for people, then they'll keep coming back and they'll get stronger, and it'll be democracy that, that is lost to us. Just a plug before, I have to disappear. We've got a big event in London on the 31st of May called Change How, with people like Andy Burnham, Mark Drayford from Wales, and Lou Haig, who used to be in the cabinet, and good Labour backbenchers like Nadia Whittam and others. So that'll be a kind of 400 people at the Ministry of Sound in London. So if you fancy coming on to that, please do. But I'd like to give my thanks to the people on the panel for being part of this and being part of this Compass event, for all of you for coming. It's been so great. And I know you're going to go into some more conversations now, but my heartfelt thanks to the Compass team here in Oxford that have really worked really hard to make today happen. And for, today's great, but it's the electoral work that they do to help make sure that people like Callum and others are beating Tories. But beating Tories and beating Reform is not enough. We have to beat them and replace them with people and ideas that are going to change the nature of our economy and our democracy, because that's the only thing that matters. So we have a huge amount of work to do. Come on the 31st of May if you can, but please support Claire and the work that they do in Oxford, because it's so important to keep these people here, but then support them to do the radical things that we need doing. So thank you everyone, and it's been an absolute joy and a pleasure to be here, and I'm really glad that I could come on.
Yeah, so I'll pass over to the key.
Well, thank you to Neil, and I hope you enjoy your birthday party. Come on, thank you. We have a lot more questions than we've had time for, and it has occurred to me that what we could do is publish the rest of the questions and make it part of an ongoing discussion, and maybe our panelists might be able to send email answers or whatever, or perhaps publish it as an article. Just a thought off the top of my head. Anyway, moving on, the next and final part of our session is what we call our breakout groups, and I just wanted to give you some instructions. I'm about to outline 4 topics, each of which has a role in undermining UK democracy and requires urgent action. I'd like you to choose one of the 4 topics and join that table. Each topic is accompanied by a list of possible citizen actions for your table to discuss. So I'll just give you a brief summary of what the topics are, just to say a copy of my summary is on the table, so don't think you've got to remember it all. Right, so the first topic is what we call far-right real-world activity. This refers to the interconnected network of far-right players recently enhanced by Trump. They include events, for example, the Gaza war, and increasing anti-Islam sentiment. Party factions, Reform, Tories, grassroots organisations, there's a lot of these, Patriotic Alternative, Homeland Party, Turning Point, and a very, very nasty one called 764. Think tanks, Taxpayers Alliance, Global Warming Policy Foundation, EIO, Institute of Economic Affairs. Individuals, Paul Marshall, Tommy Robinson, Miriam Cates, and the rest, there's a lot of them too, as we know. And donors, for example, American Friends of Global Warming Policy. So these are just examples of the different aspects of grassroots, real-world far activity that we need to think about. Please don't feel that you have to be familiar with all these groups. Our focus today is how to tackle the problems for democracy that groups like these in general pose. So topic 2 is social media disinformation. Our social media network, notably X, Telegram, TikTok, and increasingly Facebook, is being used by the far right to change thinking and voter preferences. The far right is driving the spread of online disinformation on a range of things, from everything from climate change to misogyny, anti-LGBTQ, anti-woke, toxic masculinity, and other hate narratives. According to Full Fact, quote, "In the disinformation war, the bad guys are winning at the moment." So, questions we can ask are, is the Online Safety Act fit for purpose? If not, what precise reforms are needed? How do we counter influences like Andrew Tate, the practice of red pilling, that's online radicalisation, and other forms of disinformation? So that's topic 2. Topic 3 is news media disinformation, which is a slightly different thing. So whilst readership of physical newspapers has diminished, we've also seen an upsurge in radical right outlets on paper and online. Right-leaning legacy press, such as The Spectator and The Telegraph, have shifted further right and have also been boosted by new media such as GB News and a plethora of related podcasts and so on. What should government do to, for example, resurrect the Leveson inquiry and give Ofcom greater powers, as some of our speakers were talking about, improve accountability, transparency, and meaningful penalties for spreading disinformation? And our final topic, topic 4, is the broader one of broader constitutional reforms. What reforms might be needed to prevent our democracy from being undermined? As Trump's actions have shown, democracies that lack clear separation of judicial and executive powers and rely on nothing more concrete than the word of good chaps can be dismantled extremely fast. The UK government urgently needs to close loopholes on foreign donations, the use of dark money. It also needs to increase transparency and accountability for government departments and ministers, introduce reforms to the House of Lords, to our voting system and voter registration, as Tom was saying. How can we best push for these sorts of changes? So we'd love to hear your views. Please could you decide which table you'd like to go to? I think...
So it's in order you announce them, it's clockwise around the room. So we've got far right real world over on that side of the room. At the back we've got social media, news media this half of this wall, and a reforming democracy, these two tables on this half of this wall.
So we've got real world, far right, social media, press media, and broader constitutional changes.
And there are signs on each table if you are looking for one.
And just say, please could you nominate someone from your group to give a brief summary of some of the points you've raised? It doesn't have to be, particularly tidy. We're just interested to hear what you've been talking about. And any conclusions you might have come to, or if you felt you couldn't come to any conclusions. We'll listen to as many summaries as we can fit into this final part of the day. Please hand your summaries to us at the end, as we plan to use them as a basis for future Compass Oxfordshire campaigning. Okay, ready, steady, go. Don't all go to one room, please.
Thank you all very much for your contributions up to now. And I'm sure the groups have all worked very hard. So, have all the groups nominated somebody who's going to speak on their behalf? Because I'm going to ask you to come up here, and then and there is a camera running if you want that, but if you've got them off, we can respect that, of course. So I'm going to just call up group 1 who's sitting over there. Oh, well, fantastic, Bernadette, wonderful. I'll just introduce you as Bernadette, and if you're happy to, shall I hold that for you while you speak?
Oh, that would be great, yeah, because that way I'll hold the microphone. Yeah, how's that? Yes, it is. We've got two sides, actually, because we were so productive.
Wonderful. Okay, well, off you go.
Okay, so we identified lots of problems, but came up with very few solutions.
Can you say what the topic
Oh, we were talking about the far right in the real world and what can be done about various institutions pushing their narratives. Have I got that right, Claire? Yes, good. Okay, so first of all, someone pointed out that the far right is successful because they have very simple answers to things. They're not usually having to produce any practical plans, so it's very easy for them to come up with simple solutions that they don't actually have to implement, or haven't had to up till now anyway. Someone else referred to the low traffic neighbourhoods and its impact on the local elections, and said that a lot of people have said they're going to vote reform as a result of the low traffic neighbourhoods, which they're very upset about. And it was generally agreed that it's not so much that reform seems to offer solutions to these, as that, as the person who raised this said, they just want to give someone a bloody nose, and people want to break something. It was the same with Brexit, I think. And our third thing, I should crack on with it, that people assume that anything that's not the status quo has to be better. So it's not even necessarily that they think reform as the answer so much as they think that it's got to be better than the status quo that's already there. This is a point someone raised, which I think we all thought was very important, is that people are just not very politically engaged. And education is part of that. In schools, people are just not taught necessarily to think critically at the secondary school level. So by the time they get to voting age, they just can't be bothered, or they don't want to know about it because they're not used to engaging their brain. So we thought education was key, and starting young. This is an interesting point as well. It's a very cultural one. People thought that arguing about politics didn't come naturally to British people, and we were all taught to be polite and to not debate or get angry about things. And we were comparing it to continental countries. I think someone mentioned Switzerland, and I think also when I lived in Italy, people would get absolutely outraged, and they'd often be agreeing, but they would be arguing about politics at a very basic level. It was built into their everyday discourse in a way that it's not here. Someone compared it to football here and said that politics in other countries are the equivalent of football here. An important point also is that our adversarial system naturally leads to people, it's a very argumentative system. It doesn't lead to much consensus. So you're either with someone or you're against them, and that doesn't make for much consensus voting either. We pointed out various PR failures where there were so many small parties. The Netherlands was a case in point, that you ended up with masses of tiny political factions that can't agree. So we thought if PR was the answer to all of this, then it had to be a very specific system that dealt with that problem of different factions falling out, who should be aligned, as is the case in the Netherlands at the moment, but each have their own agenda. Someone pointed out that the far right relies on othering. So, if we come together as communities, it's harder to other people. The left are too happy to accept the right-wing narrative about immigration and to play to the reform point of view. I think a few people have said that trying to take votes from reform by playing to the right-wing view is not a successful strategy, or it might be in the short term, but not in the long term. I better hurry up because is someone going to ding a bell? And Claire made a final point, which is the last one we're touching on, is that someone went to Clacton and went around asking people whether they wanted workers' rights taken away, whether they wanted the NHS privatised, raising various issues with the people in Clacton who said, no, of course we don't want those things. And this person pointed out that Farage and Reform had voted for all those things in Parliament or voted against those things. So it's often the case that people don't actually know what Reform or the far right stands for. They just want to break something, but they don't actually know what alternative is being offered. Sorry, was that too long?
Thank you very much. We've got group 2, and I suppose if we aim to be 5 minutes or slightly over, that'd be fantastic. So
points are issues.
There we go.
Okay.
No placard.
No placard. Topic 2 is on online and social media disinformation.
Hold your mic up.
Sorry, is that better?
Yeah.
So our conversation was pretty lively, even heated, which was kind of apt given its social media. So we talked about the need for teaching social media, media awareness and critical thinking in schools, and how you do that. There's a lot of pressure on the curriculum. It's the bottom of the list, that kind of issue. So possibly, engaging with talking at school assemblies with an ultimate aim to get that kind of thing on the curriculum. We made the point that the right wing are better organised and funded to influence people on social media. So of course you've got things, not only oligarchs and well-funded organisations, but Russia also pushing similar lines. Going back to education, a broader political education and awareness, particularly with voting at 16 being suggested now, there's got to be a degree of political education around that, and the influence of social media could be included in that perhaps. The point was made that a lot of the discourse around this is very negative, so when something good has happened, we should leave good reviews, basically, say this good thing has happened, and try to get some traction on that. The difficulty with that, of course, is on a lot of the platforms that exist, you're fighting on their ground, and the algorithms would be against us. They promote the toxic, the controversial, and essentially right-wing views rather than progressive views. Which goes on to how we would reach the disconnected, those who don't engage in media, who might just see a tiny fraction of what's going on. And we talked again about LTNs and citizen assemblies as kind of alternative ways of reaching people in the broader community who are not on social media perhaps as well. So it was an interesting and challenging issue for us to address, I think. Okay.
That's a good tree. Have you a spokesman? A spokesperson, sorry.
Yes.
Wonderful. So if you remind us what the theme was and what you concluded.
Yes, our theme was the established media. I can't remember the full title, to be honest. Yes, I haven't really got a list because I thought somebody else was taking the notes. But no, I think we spent a great deal of time defining what the problem is, and you know it's a complicated subject. There is a clear difference in the media between written media and broadcast media. The broadcast media, of course, quite strongly regulated, but in a way which doesn't necessarily work very well. You have this tendency in the broadcast media for impartiality being judged by having two cases that have to be set aside each other. Regardless of the fact of, it might be a case where with good analysis you could pretty clearly arrive at the judgment that one side is based on a lot of fact and very supportable and the other side isn't. But what we get is two sides presented as though they're equal in value. Newspaper sales are declining because the online presence of newspapers is still very strong, and they're still very influential in setting the agenda of news. And we arrived at that point as well that a great deal of what we get as news comes from how stories are firstly chosen. There are many stories that we probably should hear about which do not get mentioned at all, and the very choice of what's in the news is a massive source of bias. What do we need to do to improve on things? Well, it seems hard not to think that stronger regulation is needed, whilst recognising that that's an incredibly difficult thing to do because of the claims of shutting up free speech that come along with that. So, but government does need to do something to improve the standards in journalism. Now, one thing finally that was on our title that we don't see as necessarily a big issue, a big problem, is, what was the word on the sheet? Disinformation. Do we have disinformation in the media? Probably not, or not a lot. But there's enough problems just with this question of what actually gets reported as news, and the way stories are framed, creates an awful lot of misleading for readers. There doesn't need to be a lot of disinformation to have the big problem that we've got. But that's it. Basically, we didn't have any grand solutions, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Michael. Wonderful. So we move on to the final group, which is the one Tom and I were part of. And I'll ask Les if she would kindly present the conclusions. And I'll hold your paper if you like.
Well, I was going to say we're going to be here for quite a long time now because it's a massive essay that I've written. It was really hard to write it all down, and I don't know if I've written it correctly because everybody was talking so vivaciously. So we started with looking at reforming democracy, and we started off by looking at what's wrong with our democracy. I will just go, I think, for the highlights that there are here. So one point we made is that there's 11 campaign groups trying to reform our electoral system. How do we get all of those progressives working together in a single movement? One of the problems being that, for example, Unlocked Democracy and MVM, we're apolitical. Compass isn't apolitical, and in constitutions it's difficult then for us to work together as groups, which makes it slightly more difficult. We thought about what the tipping points were that are going to get people actually activated into doing something about their electoral systems. I mean, for example, in the Labour Party, the leadership are the problem in the Labour Party, but not the grassroots of the Labour Party. So it's that we've got to try and get through somehow. Sorry, I can't read it now. So we keep defending what we're trying to do. I think, for example, during the Thatcher years, people, although the NHS was deeply flawed, we were actually defending it rather than looking at it doesn't have to be that way. We can do things, organise things differently. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to try and remember what I'm meaning here. Oh yeah, so in the Labour Party now then, as we had in the Conservatives in the past, we've got, I mean this is the problem, we've got a two-party system, and we've got a democracy, well rather we haven't anymore. Our system, our electoral system was formed because we had basically two parties fighting against each other, and if you like, first past the post worked in those days. It doesn't work now because we've got all these extra parties, the good ones, the Greens and the Lib Dems, as well as Labour and Conservatives, and Reform. We've got all these parties, and you have missed out. So the system just doesn't work anymore. So, beginning of any campaign, we need to think about what do we mean by democracy. Sorry, I'll try and be quicker. The Labour Party said, right, we want 1.5 million houses built, but they haven't really told us what sort of houses they think they need to build. They haven't thought about, sort of people about what housing they actually want or what they actually need. We thought actually we ought to, if we have democracy, what do we mean by democracy? Somebody said we should get rid of the crown, because while you've still got somebody, a king, you've got one person who's got more weight than anybody other in the country, and that isn't what we mean by democracy. Democracy, everybody should be equal under that democracy. Everybody should have a voice, in other words, the vote, and the opportunity to participate, not just at election time, but during the whole of a parliamentary period, using, for example, citizens' assemblies. So it's not just you don't come alive at election time, you're there all the time. We did say if you lose, you have to accept that you've lost, which I think has always happened in this country. So the number one thing is electoral reform, we thought, before we have any other reforms. Oh yes, we need to closely link, and we've thought about this in NVM, we've really got to closely link electoral reform to things that matter to people, like the cost of living, their cost of living. We have to make them see that if they get proportional representation, they're going to be much better off in their lives because of the democracy. And the last bit. Oh yeah, and bringing proportional representation into other elections, as they've done in Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland and Wales, means that the public experience that way of voting, and therefore they have a better understanding it. One thing I need to add is that as MVM, we are trying to organise a conference next year or later this year for young people. We talked about young people earlier, trying to get young people interested, especially with the votes at 16 coming through. And yes, where will people get information about that? We'll just let people know about it when we're nearer the time. But we're trying to organise something that involves young people and gets them to understand about proportional representation and the importance of them voting.
Complex discussion. I want to try and summarise the four presentations, beyond saying that it's wonderful to see people coming from so many different perspectives and being able to sit in the same room and exchange ideas in this way. And while recognising the considerable challenges that we're facing, we've also, I think, demonstrated that many of us are highly motivated and that we can actually lead on change. I'm going to hand back to Claire in one moment. The only other thing I'm going to say, which is something Claire's going to say to you before she takes over the discussion, is to express our very strongest thanks to Claire for her contribution and for working so very, very hard as the chair of Oxfordshire Campus, and I can only say I am lost in admiration for her energy. So thank you, Claire.
If we're going to be doing thanks, then I definitely have to thank my stalwart steering group, who are wonderful, couldn't do it without them. So thank you, and I'll thank you again later. Oops. A couple of things that have emerged from today. I think we've got a sense that it's quite scary and it's easy to feel overwhelmed, particularly on the social media side of things and the financial powers that are behind negative information, the fact that negativity sells, makes money. It's a very daunting task. But I also think we need to come back to that really inspiring point that the UK has a progressive majority, and it's something we should celebrate and feel positive about. But now is the time to grab the moment to really articulate that voice. And I also agree with Les that it's really important for these different progressive groups to come together. Actions, we've talked a lot, but part of the point of today, and by the way, thank you so much for staying the course, because I appreciate it's been a long session, but we wanted to grab you while you were here. There are actions that we can do. We can raise public awareness. We've talked quite a lot about how to get through to people who might be thinking about reform, and we can reach them. There are tactics for doing that. This is something we need to work out. We need to raise public awareness. We need to increase citizens' assembly engagement. We need to try to persuade government to create formal channels between citizens' assemblies and government policy-making machines. We can write letters, we can put pressure on our MPs. So we do have a range of levers, and part of the point of today was a sort of prototype discussion to see what kind of levers we wanted to pull and what things were most important to us. So thank you for going through that journey, as they say. I hate that word, but you know what I mean. I wanted to thank our speakers, but I think they've had to go, so that's fair enough. And finally, you'll have seen how much US mainstream media felt like 9 pins in a bowling alley shortly after Trump's arrival. This is shocking, but it reminds us of how important it is to foster and strengthen the sources of independent news and analysis here in the UK. Willingness to challenge and look behind the curtain of mainstream news has become ever more important, and as Jonathan was pointing out, I think it was you, there is this concern about mainstream news just using tactics like both sidesism, as I call it, to water down the debate and prevent people seeing the importance of things. So developing an alternative voice is essential to prevent a Faragian takeover in the UK. In your packs today, you will have received, amongst other things, a West England Bylines flyer. I have a vested interest in this because I'm an editor and a writer for West England Bylines. It's part of a national bylines network, and we publish articles from experts in their fields, all speaking truth to power, and also ordinary citizens who feel they've got something to say. We speak on local, national, and international affairs. This is a vital conduit for promoting progressive thinking and action in our area, and it includes, we write about the activities of Compass as well. But West England Bylines is largely a volunteer organisation without backing from major donors, so despite the high quality of the output, it operates on a shoestring and relies on ordinary crowdfunding. You will find a QR code on that little card that you got, and if you could bring yourselves to donate to that, it would be lovely, but please use the drop-down menu to go to West England Bylines, because that would benefit us directly. So, as we've shown today, there's a range of excellent levers for us as citizens to resist far-right disinformation and to work towards strengthening our democracy. But as we also know, the thing about democracy is that once it's gone, or at least it's extremely hard to retrieve. So if ever there was a time to act, as I said before, it's now. And thank you for coming today.